Hello and good morning, afternoon, evening. Welcome to concurrent session 1B, or better known as surviving and thriving in this new learning environment. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to learn something new with us. My name is Kayla Nicholson. I am a regional director for scientific partnerships here at Labster, and I'm excited to be hosting this panel. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We have several interactive moments throughout our time today using Slido. Please go to slido.com/scienceonline2020. Use the hashtag ScienceOnline2020 and ask questions or follow our polls. The room you'll want to be in is succeeding and thriving in surviving and thriving in the new learning environment. And please keep in mind, you can always upvote responses or questions from others. This session is going to be recorded and will be available shortly after, probably early tomorrow. So if you have any colleagues that are not able to join or in a separate session, feel free to share that with them as well. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Meshagae Hunte-Brown. Dr. Hunte-Brown completed her undergraduate and master's of philosophy degree in Jamaica before moving to the US and becoming a PhD student at Drexel University. So as a student at Drexel, she worked with Sue Killam on stream food webs in Panama using stable isotopes. And Dr. Hunte-Brown has always seen herself as a teacher and spent much of her academic career as a student narrowing down the level of education that she wants to contribute to. Dr. Hunte-Brown is currently teaching large introductory non-majors biology courses, as well as open enrollment environmental science courses at Drexel University. And through Drexel's emphasis on community-based learning, Dr. Hunte-Brown has taken a civic-minded approach to engaging students who have had limited exposure to the field of biology. And one of my favorite examples of this that I've learned about talking with Dr. Hunte-Brown over the past couple of weeks is the work her and her students did on the privilege of aging. Students met once a week and then spent the remainder of their class time with senior citizens in the community, answering questions like, why are bones more prone to fracture as we age? And they've also enjoyed some fun outings to learn about the aging process. Dr. Hunte-Brown has been a champion of student engagement before and during the pandemic. And like most of you here today, she has made it her mission to create these meaningful experiences for her students, regardless of the chaos and challenges that we are being faced with. And with that, I would like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Hunte-Brown.
Thank you, Kayla, for that very, very kind introduction. And welcome, everybody. We are so happy that you are here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know that we are joining from multiple time zones, and Kayla has already told you a lot of my story, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. I've been asked to talk about surviving and thriving in this new learning environment. And just a reminder, Kayla has already pointed out that we are going to be using Slido because we're going to have some interactive moments, and that the session is being recorded and will be available on demand probably tomorrow or thereabouts. So just to go ahead and jump right in, most of us have very recently taken a crash course in remote learning. And if you think about the words of Richard Branson, who said, if someone offers you an amazing opportunity and you're not sure that you can do it, say yes, and then learn how to do it later. And that's kind of what we have been doing as we've been thrust into this pandemic, haven't we? We have been literally building the airplane as we have been flying it. But this has created some frustration and anxiety for us as instructors, administrators, as well as for students who are living through this with us as well. So I want to think about for a moment, what kinds of challenges, what are the kinds of things that our students might be concerned about as they are adjusting to learning in a remote environment. Some students find learning at their own pace to be a really good fit for them, whereas others really find what feels like a lack of structure to be somewhat demotivating, and it may be hard for them to navigate this. And there are communication barriers. If we were face to face in person, even now, you could raise your hand and ask a question. If we were in a live classroom, the students would raise their hand and ask a question. And I typically, when a student asks me a question, respond with a question, a leading question, to help them with their thought process and guide them to the knowledge that they're trying to construct. But when we're in a remote environment, we can't really do that in the same way. If we have an asynchronous session, then it really becomes difficult to do. And we're asking students to email us, and that creates this barrier for this flow of communication between us. And that can be challenging and frustrating for us, the instructor, and for the students. And then there's this boundary between home and school. What is home now? School used to be the place that you went to learn, and home was where you might do some learning, but mostly you are relaxing and rejuvenating and feeling refreshed. And there was a clear division between these spaces and their functions. And now everything is blended together. This can be jarring for the students. And then lots of us talk about having extra time with our families and how happy we are to have that. But that also presents its own set of distractions with having family around all the time at times when we want to be working, and even our pets can sometimes provide distractions for us. And then I know that you have felt just like I have an increased workload as we are living through this pandemic and still trying to be productive. I have felt many times that I'm doing 3 times the amount of work that I used to do, and our students are feeling this too. Some of them feel, and we can talk about what this means in a whole different session, that they are teaching themselves. No, we know that's not true, but that's how they feel, and that's their reality. That's what they feel like they're experiencing right now. This increased workload. And then we also have to talk about the digital divide, because not everyone has the same access to computers and hardware and high speed internet. And trying to navigate those circumstances can be frustrating and burdensome to our students. And lastly, our students are also challenged by the fact that school was not just supposed to be about academics. School, just like work for us, is also a place where we socialize, where we make connections, we make human connections, and we talk to people and we greet people. And we sometimes engage in things that we enjoy through the people that we meet in what's supposed to be our workspace. And now all of that has seemed to be taken away because of what we are living through at this time. So, knowing that these are the kinds of things our students are struggling with, how can we set our students up for success? One of the things that we want to be able to do really early is establish an online presence. The things that I have listed on this slide are things that are important even in a face-to-face live class setting. The thing is that they come naturally in that setting. We have to be more deliberate when we're thinking about these in an online setting. So how do we establish our online presence? Because you see, student learning, their sense of belonging and their satisfaction are really tied to teaching presence, social presence, and cognitive presence. With teaching presence, how can we facilitate that deep thinking and the social processes that are involved in a classroom that really foster meaningful learning? Social presence. When we're face to face together, it's clear that you and I are real people. But when we are talking to each other through a screen, it becomes a little bit more challenging. And we have to make sure that we perceive that the people in this environment, this online environment with us, are exactly that, real people. And we have to try to project that we are real as well, that there's a living, breathing human being on the other side of that screen. And as far as cognitive presence is concerned, we really have to help and guide our learners' ability, help them to construct and confirm meaning through this sustained reflection, constructing the knowledge, reflecting on it, and continuing dialogue about it. And that's how we begin to establish an online presence. We have to connect with our students. And to do this, we should lead with kindness and lead with patience. And I'm aware that we have all kinds of attendees that are operating or working in a K-12 environment and some in tertiary. So I found this infographic and I just thought it really demonstrated one of the things that I wanted to say. And I hope that you'll find that all the things that we're talking about are broadly applicable, even though this particular infographic might seem like it's well suited for a K-12 environment. But we really have to recognize that it's important how we show up even in an online space. It's important for us to realize that we can light up and that space, and it's up to us to build up our students and help them to learn in that space. And very important to never give up. Help our students to embrace a growth mindset. We've talked about the challenges that they're facing, and some can feel despair, but we have to realize that our positive support or supportive presence can often be the most significant influence on a student's day. Acknowledge for them that it's going to feel strange at first. It felt strange to us when we had to try to figure out how to deliver a good, meaningful learning opportunity in this environment. So acknowledge for them so that they know that they're not alone, that it is going to feel strange at first. Let them know that you are going to be patient and flexible with them, and make sure you're patient and flexible with yourself. And ask the students, be vulnerable and ask for their flexibility and patience and understanding as well. If that video that you posted did not play the way that it should, if the grades did not go up on the day that they should at the precise moment that you had promised, that we are going to give each other grace and flexibility and patience through this process. Assure them and mean it that you are going to help them solve any problems that are interrupting their learning, and help the students to connect with each other as well. Provide them with online icebreakers, Zoom breakout rooms, help them to connect with each other. I just attended a talk yesterday, and in a face-to-face setting, we would have been milling around the room. It was a informal pedagogical talk. We would have been moving from small group to small group and talking to each other. So the moderator had Zoom breakout rooms and just kept shuffling them every 5 to 7 minutes or so in small groups so that we could just talk to each other and make connections before we moved into the presentation. These are things that we can do with our students as well, and then pop into those breakout rooms to help to connect with them in a smaller setting. It's really going to be important as we try to prepare our students for learning in this new environment to set expectations. Let's face it, disappointment comes when we have unmet expectations. We are disappointed when our students don't perform in the way that we expected them to. And they are disappointed when they don't have the outcome from the course that they were looking forward to. So if we can set expectations up front and clearly outline them in our syllabi. I like to spend my very first lecture talking to the students about the syllabus and explaining to them that I'm going to give you some rules, but these rules aren't meant to be burdensome and oppressive. Instead, these rules are actually like lane lines on a highway or barriers on a bridge, so you can actually make it across the bridge without falling into the river. You want to be able to get to your destination. So let's talk about expectations and how you can lay a path out to get to your desired goal. So it's going to be important that among these expectations that you set up a communication plan for them. Let them know when they can expect a response. I let my students know that if they'll get a response from me in one business day, and I tell them what that means. It means that if you email me at 7 p.m. on Friday evening, you may not get a response until 10 a.m. on Monday. And it's fine, because whatever your issues are, they can be solved then. And the truth is, between us, that I check my email much more often than that. But on the off day where I have to run to soccer or run somebody to a doctor's appointment, if I'm not checking email every 10 minutes, then at least my students aren't disappointed that they did not get a speedy, or what they might refer to as a speedy response. So we want to set expectations about communication and turnaround times. We want to make sure that we decide early what the course structure is and communicate that clearly to the students. We want to think about attendance and communicate that to them as well. Is attendance going to be important for your context? Is attendance going to be a substantive part of their grade? Or is attendance going to be for extra credit? Or based on your context, is it not important that attendance is tracked as long as they're meeting their learning goals? We need to decide what attendance means for our context and then communicate that upfront to the students so that they have no surprises at the end. And then think about, in a face-to-face setting, how you would normally get students settled in. Would you be doing icebreakers or small group activities like the one I just described, and reframe that in a remote setting? Another thing that's critically important is building in time for technical difficulties. It really is imperative that we make allowance for this, because technical difficulties are going to happen, not just for the students, but also for us. When I got thrust into, with the entire world, remote teaching and working remotely in the spring term, I tried my very best to model my online classroom as I did my face-to-face classroom, because I wanted the students to have what I thought was an authentic experience. And in my face-to-face classroom, they would have their exams on Fridays at 8 a.m. There are large classes, 400 to 600 students. And at our university, we have a designated exam time slot for large classes to reduce conflicts. So I would have their exams on Fridays because I wanted to give them that Friday class period off, because who is going to be ready for learning again anyway after a big exam? And then it would give time for students who really wanted to come and talk to me about their exam, that they could do that easily. So I had exams on Fridays and they would have that class period off. So I set that up in my online setting. And then what happened was, because I also wanted to make it so that students who are in different time zones, because I had students on the West Coast of USA all the way through Asia, and I didn't want to force students to wake up at 3 a.m. to take an exam. So I opened my exam period for 24 hours, but once you started, you only had a limited amount of time. But then what this meant was that when technical difficulties happened at 10 p.m. on Friday, I had to then make myself available right through the weekend to be helpful to the students. And from a personal perspective, that did not work well for me, because it meant I had to take time away from my family obligations. So this time around, my exams are on Thursdays. And I had learned this lesson before. I don't know why I temporarily forgot it, because in my online class, all my work is due on Tuesdays for the same reason. Instead of it being due on the weekend, I have all my work due on Tuesdays, so that there's an actual work day where I can help students if technical difficulties arise. So we want to build in time for technical difficulties, and we want to check in with our students. There's so many survey tools. It's so easy now to just check in, check up on them. Last term, I had a discussion board that was for no points, where I asked them, you've made it through 2 weeks of emergency remote teaching. How are you feeling? But you can only respond with a meme. And it was fun and whimsical, and I had a grand time, responding to their responses to that discussion thread. So use a survey tool, check in on them, check in on what time zones they're in. It may not be appropriate for you in your context to do what I did in terms of allowing for different time zones, but at the very minimum, you need to let them know what time zone their deadlines are in, again, so that they have the proper expectations. And with the best of intentions, we're going to miss something. So ask them, what can I do to support you? You might get a really good idea that's appropriate and actually doable, something you can actually implement. And even just asking them, taking the time to pause and say, tell me what you need, will build so much goodwill and let the students know that you are in their corner trying to help them to succeed. So we really want to lay out a roadmap to success for them. Give them tips to start their semester off strong. I send them an email before classes even start to say, here are the common pitfalls. Here are the things that this quasi-freedom that you might feel you have with remote learning, here are ways that people often have challenges, and here is how you guard against them. So give them those tips up front so they can know how to start strong. Let them know that they're going to need physical space, that having a designated physical space is really going to help them with their learning. Let them know that they need to map out their time. For example, in the context of a college course, if this is a 4.5 credit course, then you would have been spending 4.5 hours or more in face-to-face contact with myself or a TA. So you need to expect to be spending at least that much time plus your homework time. So I help them to understand the time requirements and that emotional space is important as well, and so that they encourage them to engage in self-care. So how are we going to motivate our students to learn, especially now? I took a small course over the spring term through a teaching academy, and one of the things that we read was this piece of work called How Learning Works, the 7 research-based principles for smart teaching, and one of the chapters was focused on motivating students. And it talks about how in order to motivate students, they have to see value. So we have to help them see the value in what they're doing. Some students are going to be intrinsically motivated to do well, and others extrinsically motivated, and that's fine. They want the grade because it gets them the GPA to get them the job or to get them into another class that they're interested in, and that's fine. Extrinsic motivation isn't necessarily a bad thing if it causes them to show up and engage. So we need them to see the value. We need them to have positive expectancy. So they must know that they can succeed. I'll tell you a quick story, which goes all the way back to my son, who is now 13, being in kindergarten. And in his kindergarten classroom, there was a behavior chart, there were school buses, and each child had their name on their little school bus, and there was a red, yellow, and green light. And if they behaved themselves all day, if they were learning when they were supposed to be learning, and drawing their letters, and being kind to others, and respecting their surroundings, their bus stayed on green. If they had to be corrected, then their bus moved to yellow. And the teacher kept a chart all week, and if your bus moved or stayed on green, then she would put a check mark beside your name. So at the end of the week, if you had 5 check marks because your bus didn't move, which means you were good all week, you were never naughty, then at the end of the week, you got to pick a prize from the prize box. The problem with this method was that if you misbehaved or made a mistake on Monday or Tuesday, early in the week, then there was no path to recovery. And so my son interpreted that as, well, I might as well do whatever I please. If I stood up when I shouldn't have stood up on Monday, if I spoke out of turn on Tuesday, then all bets are off for the rest of the week because there was no path to recovery and there was no way for him to get a prize. So even though he saw the value in behaving, he didn't have positive expectancy if he made a mistake. And even though his kindergarten teacher was lovely and supportive, there was that one thing was missing: the ability to self-correct, the ability to get back on track was taken away in this process. And so he wasn't motivated to do what needed to be done. So we have to give our students value. We have to show them that this can happen. And that might come through the context of designing a rubric and then using the rubric in such a way that they can see that they actually have the power to get the success that they desire in the class, and that you will support them in doing this. How do we translate all this to lab experiences? We're at a Labster conference after all. So how do we translate all of this to a lab experience? And we're going to start a Slido question now. And I want you to think about what are some of the challenges or opportunities that you see in delivering what was traditionally intended to be, or what was originally intended to be, a lab-based course. And I'll give you just a minute to think about that. Respond in Slido, and we'll see your responses. Creating a lab report from virtual simulations that match the scientific method. Yes. Not being able to articulate in the room, articulate learning outcomes, creating a safety and PPE, hands-on experience, opportunity to discuss actively. Yes, all of these are important challenges that we want to think about how we can overcome as we move into a remote environment. So where does that leave us? All the challenges that we thought of just now. I mean, the truth is that online labs are not for everyone. They are not for every course. They're not even for every student, but there are often more advantages and opportunities than some might think. So I want to talk about what some of those advantages and opportunities might be, and we'll see how they tie back or address some of the challenges that we just talked about in our Slido interaction. Now, there is some content that students can attain equally well from remote labs. We have been programmed to think that there are certain things that our students have to be standing behind a bench with a Bunsen burner and some agar jelly and some hydrochloric acid in order to be able to learn. And that really isn't true. There are some things that students can get equally well while not in a lab. As we think about the challenges we discussed as students are having with this remote context, having a remote lab experience can dramatically increase their engagement in a remote course and have them begin to feel better about the remote course. And it helps them also to see value. We talked about motivation. We helps them to see value in what they're learning during this time, because many are feeling that this time is a wash and they're not really accomplishing anything, but it will help them to see the value in what they're learning now and how it's even preparing them for when we come out on the other side. So just to call your attention really quickly to this data set, I have the reference up for you at the end, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. But here is a look at a table from some primary research where these investigators were looking at some of the concerns that we often have with a face-to-face lab and how a remote or virtual lab can address it. Things like safety concerns, where we're very concerned in a face-to-face experience, a live experience, about student safety in the lab. Lack of self-confidence, because we worry that if a student does not feel confident about what they are doing, that they might be a danger to themselves or to their peers in the lab. We worry about equipment and expensive equipment. We worry about running out of time. We worry about not being able to confirm, do repeated experiments to emphasize or really concretize what students are being exposed to. And all of those can be addressed through virtual labs. How are we going to get our students to buy into this idea that they can still achieve meaningful learning through these experiences? And how do we get ourselves to buy into this idea as well? We can share information with our students. What I have here on the slide is something that you might include in your syllabus or in one of your recordings or synchronous talks with your students online, letting them know that lab activities are a key part of their course. And despite the fact that you're unable to meet with them face to face, the lab activities are going to deepen their understanding of key concepts. They're going to give them a chance to apply what they have been learning through the lecture or the theory part of the course. And if you include hands-on labs, and you will tell them that they will get the chance to get up from their computer and use their hands to do stuff. And some instructors will give flexibility. They might say, for this particular chunk of content, I will allow you to choose from a hands-on activity or from a virtual simulation. So if you're going to provide choice, then you will let them know that as well, and students can get excited about that. So again, in the context of our lab experiences, we want to give them a roadmap to success. We have to help them understand the time commitment. I can't stress that enough. We've said this before, but I've tried to help my students to understand that if you are face-to-face with me, you were going to be in lab for 2 hours or 4 hours or 3 hours. So expect that you are going to spend at least that much time on this virtual remote lab experience as well. Help them to understand what their deliverables are going to be. Let them know that up front. If you're using a tool like Labster, for example, there are questions built in. And if that's all that they will have to deliver, great, let them know that. But what if you want them to build on the experience? What if we're going to talk about a wraparound activity we can get the students involved in? If we want them to do something else, then we have to let them know what that is as well. One of the most valuable experiences when we have students in lab is working together in groups. And there's still ways that we can help students collaborate even through a remote lab experience. So if that's going to be factored in, we want to let them know that upfront. Because you, for example, could give them an activity to complete and then say, now I want you to work in groups and put them in groups in a Zoom session or to work asynchronously in groups to design the next step in this process and have them build on the experience that they just did. And you can do that through collaboration. You also want to make sure that your grading philosophy is very clear, especially if you have an activity where they can do multiple attempts. Think about your context and whether or not you would like to take the grade for the first attempt or the best attempt or the average score and communicate that to them so that they are properly prepared. So I want to do another activity with you and a quick think, but let me describe what we're going to do first. I want you to think about the learning objectives as they are currently described in your syllabus. And I'm going to show you mine as an example. Here is a lab course that I've been teaching for many years. And I'm going to tell the students that this lab course is designed to be a companion course for cells, genetics, and physiology. And because it's a companion course, the course objectives are the same. And I'm going to tell them what those objectives are. And as many of us are programmed to, I'm going to tell the students, instead of saying this is what your lab objectives are, this is what the lecture topics include. So I go through and say, okay, we're learning photosynthesis, so here's a photosynthesis lab. We're learning about mitosis, so here is a mitosis lab. Instead of paying attention, because the goal at that point was to really try to make sure the lab was relevant, to really try to make sure that the students saw the lab as tying to what they were learning in lecture and connecting the two for them. So I made the connection by showing them the lecture topics and said, okay, you will have a lab on this. And what I want you to do is think about your own syllabus and think about whether there are any learning goals that are not actually tied to physically being in a lab, and what are those learning goals? And is there another way that you can expose your student to that opportunity? For example, I told my students that I wanted them to be able to identify in this lab course, one of the learning objectives was identify the cells of which we are made. So think about, we're going to move to another Slido. Think about the learning objectives in your syllabus. Will take just a quick minute. You can revisit this thought experiment later, but just a quick minute. Is there anything on your syllabus that really isn't tied to being in a lab? I'm going to set my timer for 60 seconds. Very good. I'm seeing some really great examples here of things that we have tried to teach our students through lab, in a lab, that's not necessarily tied to being in a lab. And if we can sort of open up our mind, then we can begin to think about other ways to help students advance to that learning goal. In my own example, at the time when I wanted students to learn what kinds of cells we are made of, it meant I gave them a microscope. But do they really need a microscope to learn what cells look like? Not really. And I saw examples of learning to write critically and professional behavior and designing experiments. What are the things that we are really trying to help students achieve? So begin by figuring out what you want your students to learn. Is it hypothesis development? Is it experimental design? Do they need to know a particular protocol? Do you want them to know how to manage data? Do you want them to be able to predict results from data? These are things that we teach through labs that aren't necessarily tied to being in a lab setting. So let's talk about some of the options that we can utilize for remote-based lab learning. We can use kits, which will give a hands-on experience, or we can have students run to a store and buy materials that they need and do what's commonly referred to as kitchen science. The nice thing about this is that they get up and they're doing, and many of them, if you've stressed safety enough, would involve family members and get them involved in their learning as well. We can use videos of ourselves or teaching assistants in labs, or even videos that are widely available on the web to demonstrate a technique or an outcome and then have the students engage that way. If we want them to be able to manage data, they don't have to generate the data themselves. We can give them data sets to work with. If we want them to dissection and see anatomy, then there are many virtual dissection tools, and no, they won't know how much pressure to put on the scalpel. But if we're not worried about them using a scalpel in their career, then why do we need them to know how much pressure to use on a scalpel? We have to think about what's going to happen next in their career and what exactly it is we actually need to equip them for. When I talked about teaching my students about cells, I didn't need a microscope. I could have used an image library. So there are image libraries that are available that we can use to expose our students as well. Case studies. The nice thing about case studies is that we can throw the students into the virtual deep end and have them solve a problem, diagnose and treat a patient, think through a particular situation before they would be technically competent to do so. So it's very low stakes. And then, of course, lab simulations. We were at a Labster conference again, after all. So we have to spend some time talking about lab simulations. And the benefits of virtual lab simulations are many. We can really shorten the learning curve and have students apply what they're learning. And it opens doors because now we can have students working on or with or experiencing equipment that normally they may not have had access to because they were too expensive for us to let a novice student loose on, let alone some equipment that we ourselves might not have access to. We don't have to worry about safety. In a face-to-face lab, we worry about open flames and scalpels and noxious fumes and using a fume hood. What are we worrying about when we're talking about a virtual lab? Maybe carpal tunnel? And I mean, I don't mean to downplay carpal tunnel syndrome. I've had to deal with it twice, and I've had to have surgery, and I've still have permanent nerve damage because of it. So the struggle is real with carpal tunnel, but I would pick carpal tunnel problems over third-degree burns in my face or loss of vision any day, is the point that we're making from a safety perspective. We don't have to wait for incubation periods. We can jump to the good stuff when we're talking about virtual labs. And with a virtual lab, there are students who may have had a physical disability that may have trouble maneuvering through a lab space or working at a lab bench that now can access the same learning through a virtual lab. They can test predictions. We can have through coding reality adaptation. So if I were to give students a slide of, pond water, there's going to be debris and other extraneous distracting things on that slide that may take their attention away from what I really need them to learn. But we can focus with the way these labs are coded, have them focus on what is really meaningful. And then, of course, you have more chances you get to respawn if you die. If you are in a face-to-face lab and you had 2 hours and you made a mistake at the hour and 20-minute mark, then it's over because you run out of time, you've run out of reagents, the lab is going to be in use by another section, and we don't run into those issues when we're looking at virtual labs. And yes, there are drawbacks as well. We have to help our students manage their time. We've talked about this. Sometimes the lab simulations can be very costly, but there are ways that we can think creatively to move the cost away from students if we're worried about cost to students, and to even make it more cost efficient. In my context, when we moved to lab simulations in the pandemic, tens of thousands of dollars were saved because we didn't need as many teaching assistants running a face-to-face lab as we did helping students move through a virtual lab. And then we cannot ignore the technological concerns. We talked about the digital divide. So we have to make sure that whatever we're providing, we're doing so in a way that's equitable to all our students, who have to take these lab courses. As far as the best practices for lab simulations, focus on the content and not the technology. Don't just pick the shiniest, brightest, most bedazzled experience. Make sure that the scaffolding for their learning is actually really there. It's sometimes also very helpful to give your students something to do before the simulation as well as after the simulation so we can help connect it to the rest of the course. An example of something like that might be an extension activity. You can ask your students, okay, I'm going to give you this lab simulation and you need to complete it. But when you've completed it, I also need you to submit to me the purpose. What was the purpose of this lab? What was the background information? What did you need to know in order to do well and get the answers correct? What kinds of data did you collect? And how were the data analyzed? And what was the ultimate conclusion? Have them write something to connect this activity to the rest of the course and the rest of their learning. Now, to talk about how we use Labster in my context at Drexel, we were thrust, as everyone was, into emergency remote teaching in the spring term. And at that time, we had multiple labs that we needed to deliver. So multiple courses across multiple departments started using Labster. And then we even used it again as an institution at Drexel in the summer term, where our biomedical engineering department that runs a summer program, they were still able to run a summer program for middle school and high school students, even though we were on lockdown and they couldn't come in. And then eventually we now have an institution license. So now all instructors at our institution have access to all of the information, but there are many different models for gaining access to Labster. If you are here at this conference, then you fall into one of two categories. Either you know how to get to and see the Labster simulations, or you can very easily find someone who can get you to viewing the Labster simulation. So we're all covered there. So go through the simulations, pick the ones that will connect with your content in the way that you need it to, and then add them to your course. The students are going to navigate through this lab experience, and proper protocol has to be followed. So you cannot pick up a slide and then say, oh my goodness, I need a cover slip, and then just grab a cover slip. In real life, you'd have to put that slide down and then take up the cover slip, and you'd have to dispose of things in their appropriate container. So you will follow proper lab protocol. The students will have to follow proper lab protocol, and it's based on mastery. And the biggest bonus for me as an instructor of large courses with up to 600 students was that the grades flowed seamlessly into our learning management system. Still, of course, we have to tweak it to make it work for us, or design an implementation plan that works for us. So what I did was I had teaching assistants. This is a screenshot of the page in my learning management system. We use Blackboard Learn. And I had TAs make primer videos, because if the students came face to face, the TAs would give a little lab talk. So the TAs would record a primer video to give them the background content that they needed to get through the lab. And then I would set up, because for my context, it was important that students did the lab at the point that I needed them to. So I would set up adaptive release so that the particular simulations would be available and then become unavailable at the times that were appropriate, because there are due dates on the Labster simulations that don't actually change the student access. So I did that through my learning management system. And it was important for me to recognize and tell my colleagues, and we all worked as well with the Labster dashboard, recognizing that settings for whether it's the first attempt or best attempt or average attempt that flows through the learning management system is a global setting. So as individual instructors, you might need to engage with the Labster dashboard if you want to do something that's different from how your IT personnel have set the global settings for access to Labster. And then point the students to the fact that there is a wonderful team of Labster support, and it's not within our wheelhouse to help them with those technical difficulties, that there are people that are paid to take care of that. So our last quick think, I'm tongue-tied, is for you to take another mental look at your syllabus and think about whether there are learning objectives that can be implemented in different ways, that can be achieved by using different techniques. So think about learning objectives in your Labster course, learning objectives in your lab course, and think about whether or not those can be achieved by using different techniques like the ones we described. Hands-on kit, a data set, an image library, those types of things. What are some other tools? Are there different learning objectives that you have that can be achieved by using different types of tools? I've set my timer. We have about 50 seconds remaining. Tough one to think about in 1 minute. Might need some more time to look through. Of course, it all ties back to the lab. Yes, absolutely. Yes, there are different things that we can do. And the point that I want to make is that if you think about it, this is a picture from one of my favorite buffets. And on this buffet, you can see food that is kind of Italian flavor, kind of Southern US flavor. And I don't know who takes claim for the shrimp cocktail, but what I want to remind us of is that you don't have to marry yourself to one technique. You can look at your learning objectives and you might think that this is well suited for giving them a data set, that this particular learning objective is well suited for providing them with an image library, but this particular one is well suited for giving them an online simulation. So you don't have to marry yourself to one technique. The world is your buffet. Pick from all the different techniques and tools that are available to you to give your students the best possible learning experience. And just to give you some feedback from what happened when I adopted Labster for the first time, here is some of the student feedback. They really liked that it was connected to their content. They really liked that in my courses, they had different options because I didn't marry myself to one technique either. So there were different kinds that we used gizmos, we used Labster. And what I thought was of note is that no one complained, because I imagine that when I showed this to my colleagues, many of them thought that the graphics were not as exciting as they could be, but none of my students complained about the graphics. None of my students who are active gamers complained about graphics. And the reason for that is the content and the scaffolding for the learning was there. And if the content and the scaffolding for learning is there, then you don't need shiny bells and whistles. Last thing I want to encourage you about is that you can do it and there is help. It is not our job to figure out all the technical difficulties. Our job is, we are the content experts and we want to guide the students in constructing the knowledge and acquiring the content. Allow the technical experts at Labster to support, or whichever tool you're using to support you, and we'll work together to give the students with the technical support on that side and our content expertise on the other. We will work together to give the students the best experience they can have. And with that, we're ready for opening it up for any questions that we might have. Some of these we have answered by way of the talk. So if anybody wants to pop in another question, then just let me know and we can get those questions answered for you before we have to close.
All right, looks like we have a few in here, but feel free to hop in and enter your questions. Once again, it's slido.com/scienceonline2020. The room you'll want to join is Surviving and Thriving in the New Learning Environment, and the hashtag is ScienceOnline2020.
What about when questions are too difficult for students to understand? At that point, I think I would be trying to set up a synchronous interaction with the student, again, so that I can have the opportunity of asking them leading questions to help them to tease apart what it is that they're trying to get at. All right. Thank you guys for all of your questions. Here are the references that I promised if you want to take a look at those items. And of course, the recording is going to be available soon and my contact information as well. So if there's any follow-up questions that you have, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'll be happy to continue to engage with you. And I wish you all the very best as we navigate surviving and thriving in this new learning environment.
Misha, thank you so much. That was wonderful. So thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you in other sessions today. Bye.
Thank you.